Ein Putin-versteher zu sein, ist
Being
eine der
called a
schlimmsten
Putin
Vorwürfe,
sympathizer
die man
is one of the worst accusations one can face in German-speaking Europe. Usually, it comes from people who believe they know exactly what Russia really wants. But can the West even understand what its adversaries are after? That's what we want to talk about today. And joining me for the second time is Dr. Petra Erler, a German political scientist and former state secretary in the GDR. Together with her husband, Günter Verheugen, she recently published the book The Long Road to War.
Das Buch Der lange Weg zum Krieg. Russland, die Ukraine und der Westen. Eskalation statt
Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Escalation instead of détente. Petra, welcome back. Thank you, Pascal. Let's get started, maybe with your personal experience. You were active in politics in the GDR when reunification happened. You also worked actively to help make it possible. What was that like? What was your experience? Did the West understand East Germany at the time? And did reunification happen the way you in the East had imagined it would back then?
euch das damals vorgestellt habt.
Das sind viele Fragen in einer, lieber Pascal.
That's a lot of questions in one, dear Pascal. Back then, in the GDR, we had elections on March 18, 1990, and the only question was how we wanted to join the Federal Republic. Would we join as equals under Article 146 of the Basic Law, or would it be an accession under Article 23? A majority of citizens in the GDR clearly said we want the path of accession. And that meant, of course, that from the outset, the possibilities of the last and only democratic GDR government were very limited.
Und einzigen demokratischen DDR-Regierung sehr begrenzt waren, denn ein Beitritt nach Artikel 23 bedeutet,
because accession under Article 23 means submitting in many ways to the rules that the old Federal Republic had set for itself. Meanwhile, a different form of union would have led, for example, to a shared constitution, and to discussions about important matters such as whether to have a common anthem and how much experience, as well as realization, from the GDR would flow into this new country. For there is no doubt that German unification created a new country. At that time, I was responsible for integration into the European communities, and in my field, by March 31st, 1990, the guiding principle was already, we'll do it entirely on our own.
Das machen wir ganz allein. Und diese Devise kam aus Bonn. So nach dem Motto,
and that directive came from Bonn, along the lines of, we have no business being there, we have no one to talk to, and the West Germans will take care of it. But that wasn't our position. We believed that all members of the European community, as well as the community of nations, had the right to get to know us, to find out who we actually were. Because the East-West conflict had led to a situation where the West had little interest in the East, but the East had a great deal of interest in the West. And accordingly, we went to the Irish presidency at that time.
Sind wir damals zur irischen Präsidentschaft gefahren. Ich habe den Außenminister Merkel begleitet.
I accompanied Foreign Minister Merkel, and we presented our demands there and said, we want to be part of this. We want you to get to know us, but we also want to make our own interests clear. Because we couldn't imagine that the old Federal Republic knew everything that would have been important and right for the GDR in a unified Germany. And the first question from the Irish was, have you discussed this with Genscher? And we said, nope. Then there was a strategic pause of 2 hours. I drank the first Irish whiskey of my life.
Ich habe den ersten irischen Whisky meines Lebens getrunken. Und dann kam ein Berater des Ministerpräsidenten und hat gefragt, Petra.
And then an advisor to the Prime Minister came and asked, Petra, so what is it that you actually want? We had a good conversation, and after 2 hours, the meeting was formally resumed. The Irish told us, we will support you. You'll soon be part of it. And therefore, you already have the right to express your opinion and make yourselves known, who we are, and vice versa. Bonn didn't like that at all, but they accepted it. As long as we promised that, of course, we wouldn't carry out any intra-German conflicts on a European stage.
Keine innerdeutschen Konflikte jetzt auf europäischem Buckel austragen würden.
Also das war in dem Fall ein
In that case, it was a positive process that also led to you from the East being able to present your concerns within the future EU structures. Back then, it was still the economic area. That was positive. The West managed it well, integrating East Germany and initiating a process that ultimately proved successful.
It's important to remember that at that time, we had a Commission president, Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors was the first to truly understand that developments after the fall of the wall would become highly unpredictable. He told the European Parliament that we, in this case, East Germany, had the right to decide for ourselves how we wanted to belong. Based on the old clause that was part of the founding treaties of the European Economic Community, the Federal Republic of Germany had always regarded the GDR as part of its economic area. And he kept the path open and said, either you come as an equal state or by way of accession to the Federal Republic of Germany. And that created quite a positive atmosphere in the European community at the time, at least toward us. Thatcher was more favorably disposed toward the GDR government than toward Helmut Kohl. The French treated the East German prime minister with great goodwill because it was a different kind of Germany, so to speak, not one that stormed through the room, but a modest one.
And how did things go from there, also in terms of understanding? I remember well, I was born in '85, so I'm too young to really remember the unification of the states. But I still recall from my childhood that I watched a lot of German television, and it often dealt with how people in the East were doing and what was happening there. The tensions between the Besserwessis and the Jamarassis, those were topics that were present in German-language TV. So, how did this process of growing together actually happen, which also has a lot to do with understanding? And as you already mentioned, in the GDR, the longing for the West was enormous, I assume, whereas the other way around, it might not necessarily have been the case.
Well, it would be a misunderstanding to think at first that the whole process was only positive. What I meant to say is that we received support from many European countries, that we had the right to appear in the European community, to speak with Delors, to speak with heads of state and government. I didn't say that the Federal Republic of Germany necessarily liked that, because of course we didn't just say, here we are, but we also explained what problems we saw in this process. And the point was that all member states in the European community had to agree, so that through a council decision, we could then participate in this unification in the event of German reunification. And much later, I learned how much the old federal government hated. That we, for example, said we didn't want to be dependent solely on West German funding, but that we believed it was important for European solidarity to also reach the new states, so that people there would feel integrated. That went completely against Helmut Kohl's concept, for instance. And it was very good that we found support for this in the European Commission at the time. The first to speak out in that direction back then was the liberal Bangemann. But it was a tough struggle, and every single presentation of demands was a hard fight that had to be waged more behind the scenes than in public. And from that you can see that we had a certain self-confidence.
Und daraus erkennst du, dass wir ein gewisses Selbstbewusstsein hatten. Wir hatten das Selbstbewusstsein, egal ob wir beide.
We had the self-confidence. Whether we joined or acted under Article 146, we had something to say, and we said it in a way that would benefit the new Federal Republic. Because it became clear fairly quickly, at least to us, that this wouldn't be a walk in the park, economically or politically. And at the time, I didn't know that within 4 years, 50% of East Germans would be unemployed. But I also knew that our companies weren't competitive. Our agriculture wasn't competitive. You can't suddenly compete in a market you don't know, where you have no connections and no marketing strategies, but even in 1990, I didn't yet know how bad it would get. And on top of that came, so to speak, the political problem.
Und dazu kam eben das sozusagen politische Problem. Und das politische Problem ist, dass wir...
And the political problem is that there was already a double attitude. On the one hand, hardly anyone in West Germany was prepared for the fact that there would only be German reunification. And they also had clear opinions shaped by the Cold War. That meant they can't do anything anyway. The economy doesn't work, nothing works. And in East Germany, there was an exaggerated expectation expressed as West Germans can do everything better, and now we have to relearn everything. This dance between arrogance and self-imposed weakness naturally had disastrous effects. Because sooner or later it became clear that East Germans weren't as stupid as people had assumed.
Dass die Ostdeutschen nicht so blöd sind, wie sie annahmen. Und dass die Westdeutschen also eigentlich kaum was davon
And that
verstanden
the West Germans actually hardly understood what was really going on in East Germany, or what life in the GDR was like. And that led around 1994 to the situation you described. I had been invited by the Americans, and they also asked, "What's going on with you? Everyone's complaining, the West isn't satisfied, the East isn't satisfied. Why is that?" They hosted an evening event and asked the first question to a Bundestag member from Hesse. What can the West learn from the East? Answer, nothing. Then I said, and that's the problem. And that was the end of the evening, because it was clear where the problem of German reunification lay, the assumption that one already knows everything. On one side, a victor's mentality, and on the other, people who were increasingly freeing themselves from the notion that the West knows better how to boil water.
Maybe we can use this to jump to the present. Because what you're describing sounds to me very much like a mentality that still prevails, and perhaps not only in Germany, but in large parts of Europe. On the one hand, a winner's mentality. On the other, this awareness. We always knew better, and the Russians and everyone who supports them or doesn't fight them just don't understand what it's about. Do you also see this awareness persisting? Especially in English, we often refer to Fukuyama and the end of history. This mentality of, we won the Cold War. Do you see that too? Or are there other elements that, in your view, stand in the way of understanding the East?
Well, I think it's a mix of disinterest, ignorance, a winner's mentality, and arrogance. And all of that is combined with the propagandistic exploitation of democracy and human rights, along the lines of, we are the bearers of democracy, we are the bearers of human rights, and therefore, a priori, we've always been on the better side of history. That frees us from having to genuinely care about others and their problems, or to really want to understand them. And that already begins with the relationship to the newer EU member states, those that joined in 2004 and 2007.
Also die 2004, 2007 beigetreten sind. Es gibt und gab und gibt kein Verständnis dafür.
There was and still is no understanding of what systemic transformation actually is, of the difficult path people have to go through when they consciously decide to build democracy and reshape their countries that were once part of the CMEA or the former Soviet Union. Not at all. I recently read an appalling book that complained that following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Homo Sovieticus still exists in Russia, and that there is a little Putin in every Homo Sovieticus.
Stecke ein kleiner Putin.
Oh God.
Oh God, that's in there. Who wrote that?
Ich mache jetzt keine Werbung für dieses Buch.
I'm not promoting this book right now, and I thought, don't they actually understand that you can only change a society with the people you have? And that the willingness of people who grew up in a different system to change is a gift that societies give themselves, a force that exists within societies themselves. You see what I mean? I'm not a follower of Che Guevara. Che Guevara set out thinking he could export the revolution. And conversely, I've always had the impression that the West believes Che Guevara works, that it can export everything. But in fact, what we need within societies themselves is the awareness of what they recognize as the right path for them.
Was sie als richtigen Weg für sich anerkennen. Und wenn man dann sieht, wie in den 90er Jahren etwa.
And when you look at how, in the 1990s, the European Commission and also the Americans dealt with the collapsing Soviet Union, they boldly said, Ukraine just needs to free itself from the Russian yoke, and then everything will be fine. They had absolutely no understanding that a state organism like the Soviet Union, built on a planned economy with monopolies where one or two enterprises supplied the entire country, could not simply be dismantled, and that Ukraine was connected to the Soviet Union through countless lifelines, economically, socially, infrastructurally, and in terms of transportation. And anyone who sets such goals truly has no understanding of the problems of nations.
Hat in Wahrheit kein Verständnis für die Probleme der Völker.
Deine Kamera ist ganz wenig nach oben gerutscht. Kannst du sie wieder ein bisschen...
Your camera has slipped up a bit. Could you move it down a little again? Thanks. So, what do you think? There was that moment in 2001 when Vladimir Putin stood in the German Bundestag and received a standing ovation. People stood up and applauded. And those were actually very, very hopeful times. That was also the period when I'd say the worst of the 1990s for Russia was coming to an end. That terrible period from 94 to 99, when even life expectancy in Russia declined. You really have to keep that in mind. And then there was a moment when German-Russian relations were actually at their peak, like never before and never again afterward. Wasn't there understanding then? Didn't the West at that time have an understanding of Russia's suffering and the need to integrate Russia? Or how was it?
Also, selbstverständlich war der Auftritt von Putin im Deutschen Bundestag.
Of course, Putin's appearance in the German Bundestag was certainly a highlight of German-Russian relations, but by no means the peak of them. I think that at the time, there was a sense of relief that the communists had not won, but rather that the candidate chosen by Yeltsin and also by the oligarchs had won the election. And of course, the speech itself was an offer of friendship, aimed at close cooperative partnership between Germany and Russia.
Partnerschaftliche Zusammenarbeit zwischen Deutschland und Russland. Aber was ich in dieser Zeit kritisiere.
But what I criticize about that time is that we missed the opportunity to remember how much suffering we brought upon the peoples of the Soviet Union. Because Putin doesn't come from just any city. His family is from Leningrad, and they too were among the victims of German Hitler fascism. And back then that played no role in any interview, in any speech, in any way whatsoever. And for him it doesn't play a role either. It was all about the future. But it was also a missed opportunity to talk about why we have a special historical responsibility, one reflected in 27 million dead Soviet citizens.
Sich in 27 Millionen toten Sowjetbürgern ausdrückt.
Also das hat man einerseits verpasst, auch das Verständnis dafür.
So that was missed on the one hand, as well as the understanding that here stands someone with first-hand experience of how terrible that war, and who also has family ties to it. Every time I talk to Russian colleagues, they tell me there's no one in Russia who isn't somehow still affected by that war. Every family is touched, 27 million dead, so everyone has a grandfather, a great-uncle, or someone else they know who died in the war.
Der im Krieg gestorben ist. Fehlt hier schlicht jetzt...
Isn't something simply missing here? Maybe not just in Germany, but throughout Europe, in Western Europe as it is today, a sense of how brutal these memories still are and what they trigger, also in terms of a need for security. Because in the West, especially in Germany, but also in Switzerland, people often say no. Russia is only pretending to need security. It's the safest country in the world, so he's lying. Putin is lying when he says that Russia has a need for security. Otherwise, he wouldn't be undermining the Ukrainians' need for security.
Also ich glaube, wir haben es mit Geschichtsrevisionismus zu tun.
Well, I believe we're dealing with historical revisionism that began as early as 1945. The perception of the Second World War is often shaped by Hollywood films, in which, of course, the Americans are constantly victorious. In France, in 1945, the prevailing view was still that the Red Army, or rather the Soviet Union, not only bore the main burden of the war, but also made the decisive contribution to the victory over Hitler's fascism. That has been completely washed out of many people's memory. There's a Canadian scholar who has studied the Stalin era in great detail, both the 1930s, the Great Purges, and Stalin's role in the Second World War and before. And he reported that his students are always completely shocked when they realize how many Germans the Red Army had to fight back then, and how few Germans, comparatively, the Allied victorious powers had to face. That's something entirely unfamiliar to us. And at the same time, one must not forget that Russians, even ordinary Russians, were for a long time very friendly toward Germans, despite the events of the Second World War. I was part of an initiative against forgetting, which de Maizière had launched, where we sent money to forced laborers, long before that was accepted in Germany, as a kind of moral compensation.
Sozusagen als moralischen Ausgleich. Es handelte sich damals erst 300 D-Mark, dann 300 Euro.
At that time, it was first 300 DM, then 300 euros. That is nothing compared to the suffering of the survivors. And the way these survivors or their families usually reacted was by saying they appreciated that we had not forgotten, and that this was a foundation for friendship. All the worse, then, that because of this historical revisionism, Germans are no longer viewed positively in Russia today, and given the political statements coming from the Federal Republic of Germany, that is hardly surprising anymore.
Und dieses, wenn wir wieder weiter in dieses Verständnis.
And this, if we keep digging into this understanding, where do you think it comes from, apart from historical revisionism and the victor's mentality, that Europe in general is currently acting as if Russia has no legitimate interests? I mean, the accusation of being a Putin sympathizer is really the accusation that one takes what the Russians say seriously, and starting from there, actually wants to think ahead and negotiate, whereas the other side says, no, one must neither believe nor listen to them. The war in Ukraine must be ended in the way we want, which means all territories returned and Putin brought before a war crimes tribunal. That, they say, is the right approach to put this entity called Russia in its place.
Well, Pascal, we're dealing with two alternative realities here. Those who accuse others of being Putin sympathizers claim that they themselves understand Putin best, and that understanding can always be summed up in 3 words: once KGB, always KGB, loosely based on the 1985 James Bond film. That's where it comes from. Meanwhile, the others recognize the legitimate security interests on the Russian side and advocate for a policy of dialogue and mutual understanding. They naturally look at what has actually happened over the years. They don't twist Putin's words. They don't just pick out what suits them and what doesn't, but rather try to present history in its sequence and also point out the disastrous turns the West has taken. But that's not the version of history that dominates in the European Union. Kaja Kallas, our so-called chief diplomat, considers Russia's and China's contribution to the victory over Hitler's fascism in World War II to be disinformation. The woman has no historical education left at all.
Die Frau hat überhaupt keine geschichtliche Bildung mehr. Und ich fürchte, andere haben die auch nicht.
And I fear others don't have them either. There were attempts, initiated by Poland and also by the Baltic states, to assign Russia or the Soviet Union partial blame for the outbreak of World War II. But that doesn't hold up to any historical scrutiny, because everything is being denied. Who at the time looked upon Hitler's Germany with great sympathy and even partially cooperated with it. It is being denied that Stalin, meaning the Soviet Union, spent over 6 years trying to form an anti-Hitler coalition with France and Great Britain, because, of course, all of this is ideologically charged.
Weil das natürlich alles ideologisch aufgeladen ist. In unserem Land, als Hitler die Macht ergriff,
In our country, when Hitler came to power, it was only the communists at first, and a few Catholics who said Hitler means war. And when Kaja Kallas today reflects on how many wars actually originated from Russia, and apparently asked her staff about it, and then they came up with some number I don't know, then I looked it up on Wikipedia to see how many wars the Russians had been involved in over the centuries, 32 pages. And you have to imagine, it even says there that there were Soviet citizens, just like Americans, including Hemingway, who fought in the Spanish Civil War.
Die im Spanischen Bürgerkrieg gekämpft haben. Also hier werden Dinge zusammengeschmissen.
So here, things are being thrown together and presented to the public in a completely disorganized way, which has nothing to do with security interests anymore, but rather aims to portray Russia's lust for war, supposedly grown over the millennia. If you just look at the wars between 800 and 1500 listed on Wikipedia, I have to ask, how many Ukrainians were involved in those? But such questions are never asked, because we only deal with history superficially and have no understanding of how it really unfolded. And those who try to get to the bottom of it are practically slapped down.
Die werden ja regelrecht abgewatscht, aber eben leider nicht mit Argumenten, sondern eben mit solchen dummen.
But unfortunately, not with arguments, but with such stupid, brazen remarks like, what do I know, fallen angels, Kremlin's water carriers, or rag pacifists. Yes, those aren't arguments, that's all, not arguments. Because they can't get through with arguments, they only get through with stereotypes. The misfortune is that such stereotypes, of course, take root in people's minds, together with fear. And we all know that fear paralyzes, fear and thinking. And the second track on which reality is being denied today, politically denied, is fear-mongering. There are already many people who believe that tomorrow the Russians will be standing in front of Berlin or right at their own doorstep.
Yes, well, fear is one thing. The other is what you mentioned. The worldviews that currently differ so strongly from each other. How one understands the world. How what we currently perceive as reality has been formed. What's fascinating right now is that in these two different worldviews, for two different reasons, both sides are saying, yes, Minsk was never meant seriously. The Russians say the Europeans never meant it seriously. We know now from Hollande and Merkel and so on, they've said it. And the Europeans are currently saying Putin never meant it seriously. He just wanted time to build up his army, and then he threw it all overboard. It's quite fascinating that at the moment both sides, for completely different reasons, come to the conclusion that Minsk was never meant seriously, or Minsk in general. But what's striking is that we can't agree on a shared reality, and instead use these worldviews to give the war a kind of logic. So that's why we're at war.
Also darum sind wir im Krieg.
Pascal, I can't give you any answer to your question at all, because I believe that the worldview of those who engage in war preparations is inherently inconsistent. On one hand, it's always said that the Russians are just imagining threats that might come from NATO. On the other hand, it's said there are no reasons for the war in Ukraine. It's purely Russian aggression. And then again, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg says, of course, the Russians didn't want NATO expansion up to Ukraine, and of course, naturally, we didn't give it to them. That means the narrative of those who attribute everything to an allegedly naturally grown Russian aggressiveness is simply not true. They can't keep up their own lies. Today, the European Union, in the person of Ms. Kallas, says again, yes, we have always wanted a lasting, just, and secure peace for Ukraine and in Europe. But in fact, that is not accurate. We all know that the Istanbul negotiations took place. We all know that we were quite close to having a chance for peace in Ukraine. There were still some unresolved issues, but they were by no means insurmountable.
And
it would have led to Ukraine remaining territorially intact. There would have been 10 years of talks about Crimea, and Ukraine would have been demilitarized. We would have had a neutral Ukraine. And then the West came and said, that's not how it's going to work. That's not what we have in mind, because it was never about Ukraine. It was always about Russia. And then this was increasingly stated openly. Our goal is to use Ukraine to strategically weaken Russia. And Ms. Kallas recently repeated this. She said, referring to the peace plan, well, the European Union has only 2 points.
Also, die Europäische Union hat nur 2 Punkte. Erstens, die Schwächung Russlands, zweitens die Unterstützung der
First, the weakening of Russia. Second, the support of Ukraine. That means there's no real strategy at all, except perhaps for the idea that weakening Russia is a pipe dream. And second, if it were actually achieved, it would lead to the only situation in which the use of Russian nuclear weapons would truly be legitimized. So I can no longer see any rational policy in this. That's why I believe that the worldview you describe, the one worldview, is based on completely distorted coordinates, but also on ideological premises that are utterly misleading and sometimes make me doubt the mental health of those who hold them.
Gesundheit derer zweifeln lassen, die das vertreten.
Aber wie kommt es? Also nehmen wir.
But how does that happen? Let's take Mrs. Kallas, for example. I can't make sense of Mrs. Kallas because she should actually, based on her biography, be a natural bridge builder. She was born a Soviet citizen, grew up in the Soviet Union until she was 16, as the daughter of a communist, not just a politician, but a leading figure in Estonia. Yes, in Estonia. And she really ought to have an understanding of everything that happened in the Soviet Union and of those historical connections. She should be able to build bridges between these different perspectives. But instead, she's the chief agitator. She even portrays herself as a victim of the Soviet Union who never ate sweets under that unjust regime her father helped lead. I can't explain it.
Ich kann es nicht erklären. Kannst du sie dir erklären?
Can you explain it? Even if Ms. Kallas had been a victim of the unjust regime, even under those circumstances, it would actually be reasonable politics to say, Estonia and Russia, as the successor of the Soviet Union, share a complicated history. And the complications are not only on Russia's side. There are also unspoken parts of Estonian history. And secondly, I am a small country, and Russia is an infinitely larger one. So what could be more natural than to try for friendship and to build connections between people? But that is not the prevailing attitude in Estonia. Estonia has treated its Russian minority only just up to the minimum standard required by the European Convention on Human Rights.
Konvention verlangt. Es hat Probleme gehabt mit der Integration.
It has had problems integrating ethnic Russians, which is partly understandable, but that doesn't mean it should be condoned. I think she rose politically in Estonia because she pursued a very sharp anti-Russian policy, on the one hand, and on the other hand, completely ignored the fact that the country lived off Russian electricity until 2024. It wasn't even connected to the European power grid, and the Russian side reliably supplied electricity. It didn't matter that Putin made money from it because Estonia had no other choice. Russia might have had another choice, but it didn't act that way.
Aber es hat sich nicht so verhalten. Und diese Politik von Estland begann bereits im Jahre
And this policy from Estonia began back in 1994. That's when an Estonian Prime Minister, Meri, showed up in Hamburg and wrote in the Hamburger's guest book, Russia is of course aggressive. And today people say he was right even back then. That's completely ridiculous. He simply held a certain view of Russia because he was a Russia hater. Plain and simple. And Ms. Kallas has built her political profile in the same way, and is therefore no longer capable of reflecting the world in its entirety, making her completely unsuitable and incapable of conducting politics, foreign policy, or even diplomacy on behalf of the European Union. And everyone knows it, in truth. Because at the beginning of the year, the European heads of state and government discussed who could talk to Russia. And Ms. Kallas's name didn't come up, actually.
But actually, it's also a tragedy. It's a tragedy. It's just so difficult to explain that we in Europe are stuck in this situation, even though we really have all the intellectual capital we would need to build understanding and mutual comprehension. It had already been built once, namely with Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, with the insight that over many years bridges must also be built from west to east. And the fact that all of that has collapsed again leaves me speechless.
Das lässt mich sprachlos.
Ja, aber ich meine, sagen wir mal, die Hochzeit
Yes,
der
but I mean, the
Russischen
peak of German-Russian relations was under Chancellor Schroeder.
Sie begann damit,
And it
dass
began with a
die
three-way pact in 2003 in connection with the Iraq War. Schroeder, Chirac, and Putin stood together against the American aggression toward Iraq, refused to take part, and condemned it loudly and clearly. And I remember we also wrote about this in our book, how the American side reacted, basically saying, oh, we don't care. But in truth, it meant, we'll tar and feather them and beat them for daring to challenge our leadership role and our increasingly militaristic foreign policy.
zu stellen und auch gegen die zunehmend militaristische Außenpolitik. Und davon ist nichts vergessen worden, gar nichts.
And none of that has been forgotten, not at all. That was the first sign that the United States would take a hard line against this Russia, now reappearing on the world stage in the person of its president, Putin.
Und es dauerte noch genau 3 Jahre.
And it took exactly 3 more years before it was said, Russia is a gas station disguised as a country. At first it was talked down, but at the same time, more and more steps were taken to keep this Russia, which was slowly getting back on its feet, down and potentially weaken it. In my view, that period began in 2007, 2008.
Begann meines Erachtens 2007, 2008.
Denkst du also, der Zeitraum zwischen 2003
So do you think that the period between 2003 and 2007 being the year when Vladimir Putin gave his speech at the Security Conference, which was really an appeal, stop, it's getting dangerous, we need to sit down and seriously talk about everything that's going wrong right now. But that means that by 2007, quite a few things were already off track. And Vladimir Putin said, we need to countersteer now, folks, here in Munich. But between 2003 and 2007, was that really when the process of European or greater European unification, meaning France, Germany, Russia, began to be undermined, or had that already started earlier?
War es schon früher?
Also es gibt ja Leute, wo man das nachweisen kann, die bereits
Well, there are people for whom this can be proven, who were already sighing in the U.S. in 1991 and 1992, that during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia itself could and should have been finished off. I'm really not one of the experts on the Chechen War or Chechen independence, but there are some indications that the support for the terrorist and separatist movement in Chechnya, at least after 1999, did not happen entirely without the help of MI6 and the CIA. Litvinenko, who was then killed in 2006, converted to Islam on his deathbed, and a Chechen newspaper wrote at the time, now he is not only our brother in arms, but also our brother in faith.
Sondern jetzt ist er auch unser Bruder im Glauben. Und in der Daily Mail war damals zu lesen, dass es...
And at the time, the Daily Mail reported that he had been working for MI6 since 2003. That's what I mean by clues. Only there was already a duality at that point. On one hand, the hatred of Russians didn't just disappear with the collapse or dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ben Hodges, for example, says, Russia has been our enemy for decades. And on the other hand, the West had to maneuver, and also wanted to maneuver, between the questions, can we bring Russia into our camp, or how do we prevent it from becoming too independent? Because the speech Putin gave in 2007 and the West's reaction to it spoke for themselves.
Und die Reaktion des Westens darauf sprach ja für sich selbst. Niemand redete über den Inhalt und jeder sagte, Gottes Willen, das ist ein...
No one talked about the content, and everyone said, for God's sake, this is an ungrateful, insolent person who has now declared the Cold War all over again. The fact that he raised points that had their justification no longer interested anyone in the discussion back in 2007. And in 2008, when the Americans practically forced France and especially Germany to agree to the NATO expansion option for Ukraine via Georgia, Merkel knew exactly what she was doing. She first said publicly in Germany, well, this is not a good idea. First, there is no majority for it among the Ukrainian population. And second, where is the added value? That's NATO statute.
Das ist ja NATO-Statut. Und 2022 hat sie eingeräumt, dass sie...
And in 2022, she admitted that she had known back then that it was a kind of declaration of war for Putin. And that shows that decisions were made with open eyes, knowing they would violate Russia's most fundamental interests. And thanks to Julian Assange, we know this telegram. That refers to the question of Ukraine's NATO membership. The reddest of all red lines for everyone who held responsibility in Moscow or in Russia. But no one cared.
Moskau oder in Russland Verantwortung trugen. Es hat aber niemand interessiert und der Mensch, der das am besten für mich zum Ausdruck gebracht hat.
And the person who expressed this best for me was again William Burns, who wrote about his experiences related to Russia. No, it wouldn't be the right question to ask who lost Russia. The right way to put it would be, Russia was never our country. And I think that's correct. Russia has always been the country of the Russians and all the other peoples. But there was an attempt to make it, so to speak, a kind of junior partner, 51st state, vassal, servant. Such vassals and servants, like the Federal Republic of Germany unfortunately is today, don't even understand that others tend to have a prouder nature. Let's put it that way.
Dass andere eher eine Spartakus-Natur haben, sagen wir es mal so. Und das ist eine der fundamentalen Missverständnisse, die Bundesrepublik Deutschland...
And that's also the fundamental misunderstanding. The Federal Republic of Germany has never been as dependent on the United States in foreign policy as it is today. You mentioned Brandt, but also Kohl, and to some extent still Merkel, Schröder anyway. And today you can read that the German chancellor says, whatever, Joe, whatever you want, I'll do it. And that's exactly how it looks in the Oval Office, this famous photo that just makes you want to shake your head. They're all sitting there like kindergarten children in front of their teacher, listening devoutly. How embarrassing, how lacking in self-confidence, and how disastrous that is for pursuing one's own interests.
Für die Verwirklichung des eigenen Interesses.
Dieses Foto hat mich fasziniert, weil in den deutschen Medien, auch in den Schweizer...
This photo fascinated me because it was shown with pride in the German and also in the Swiss media. We're sitting at the boss's table. We're in the Oval Office. We're present. Europe is there. Europe is taking responsibility and is in Washington. But in fact, it was only interpreted in our circles as a national insult. And that's exactly how it was conceived by America, quite clearly. Such an arrangement of heads of state is deliberate. It's a psychological staging where people are meant to be seen. You really have to congratulate Washington for doing it that way, for presenting themselves like that. But in Europe, that wasn't noticed at all, not understood at all.
Aber das wurde in Europa ja so gar nicht wahrgenommen. Es wurde ja so gar nicht verstanden.
Naja, ich meine, das ist das Problem mit der Hofberichterstattung.
Well, I mean, that's the problem with court reporting. When a German chancellor says it was a very good meeting in Washington, even though anyone who saw the part open to the press could hear that Trump's remark to him was, I think he has a good complexion. Yeah, and Ursula von der Leyen was congratulated. Congratulations on the wonderful trade negotiation result, in which it was clearly the Americans who prevailed. So it was obvious that Trump had a jab ready for everyone. And the other photo that came through the White House's Instagram channel, the European press didn't even have that.
Des Weißen Hauses, das hat die europäische Presse ja gar nicht gehabt. Aber wenn eben die Legende heißt, das war ein großartiges...
But when the legend goes that it was a great meeting, and at the same time people say, yes, the Americans, they really are the most important ones in this world, and without the American nuclear shield, oh, God, who knows if the Russians wouldn't already have been here yesterday, then that's where the reflection of reality stops. As I said, I think that in certain circles, and unfortunately they are opinion-shaping or opinion-leading, though not necessarily representing the majority opinion, there's a tendency to see only what one wants to see. And if what one wants to see is a nice picture where everyone is sitting in front of Daddy Trump and
vor Daddy Trump sitzen, na gut.
Wir kommen zum Schluss, aber ich möchte dich gerne fragen nach
We're coming to the end, but I'd like to ask you, just hypothetically, if there were one element you could change in Europe right now to promote this understanding or the ability to understand, which element would you change? Would you say that if the propaganda stopped, we would reach understanding? If we had real mass media that focused on actual events instead of stirring up emotions? Or would you want to change the political elite in Europe? What would you want to change to make understanding possible again?
Was würdest du ändern wollen, Verständnis wieder möglich zu machen?
Ich glaube, das ist mit einem Element überhaupt.
I believe that one element alone is not enough. But above all, I would suggest, first, listen and let go of the idea that everyone else is an enemy and only lies when they open their mouth, and let go of the idea that everyone else is worse than we are. Because the fear of Russia and the fear of China tell us a lot about who we ourselves are. The fight against this new world, which is being driven by the political elites and also by the media elites, always contains the element, oh God, if they take over, everything will get even worse. Because we've had 30 years of very bad experiences as American dominance asserted itself, or 500 years during which we roamed and ruled the world. In truth, I wish we would stop thinking that we are the center of the world.
Wir würden aufhören zu denken, wir seien der Mittelpunkt der Welt.
Ich höre genau dasselbe von unseren Kollegen.
I hear exactly the same thing from our colleagues in the Global South. Everyone says, Dear West, you have to stop thinking of yourself as the center of the world. Listen and stop ignoring.
Und Bescheidenheit lernen.
Gut.
Learn to listen and to be humble. Well, then that means for us at the universities, we go there and teach humility.
Let's see how we'll do that.
Pascal, außerhalb der Aufzeichnung kannst du wieder rausschneiden.
Pascal, you can cut that part out off the record. You were the one who had the conversation with the person from Singapore. Yes, yes. I still don't know his name. My shame. When he said that ASEAN is actually the most culturally and civilizationally diverse region in the world, I thought, Petra Erler, you're a bit Eurocentric too. You always thought it was, for example, just a model for peace. But it's not that diverse, and we hate diversity. I just wanted to tell you that. So, go ahead and give the formal closing speech now.
Also mach die förmliche Abschlussrede jetzt.
Petra, people who would like to follow you, they can buy your book that you wrote with your husband. But can people find you anywhere else? Where else should they look for you?
Well, you can find me on Substack. I have a blog there. I'm the lighthouse keeper. I post there regularly.
I'll link your Substack in the video description. Dr. Petra Erler, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for letting me be part of it again.